We're continuing with our questions and answers, and the first question we have tonight is Christian yoga or holy yoga safe or dangerous for Christians, and why I think that's in the context. Is it spiritually safe? Is it something Christians should do? And in my experience, within certain groups, there is a little bit of controversy when it comes to yoga. Some see it as a very pagan thing, and that's definitely what its origin is. And so we'll explore that tonight, and I'll give some historical context to the practice. The term yoga is extremely broad, and it denotes different unique teachings and practices depending on which group practices it, whether it's Buddhism or definitely not Judaism, Buddhism, Jainism, that's the one, or Hinduism. The ultimate goal of yoga, when it's practiced in a spiritual manner, is to achieve moksha. I'm going to throw a lot of weird words at you, but don't worry, I'll define them in a moment. And that means it refers to the freedom of samsara that one achieves when they practice it. Now, I'll explain these terms. I know they sound a little weird. In Eastern philosophies and in Eastern teachings, there is this idea of reincarnation. Basically, when you exist, you live multiple lives. You're born, you live, you die, and then you enter another life, sometimes as another person, sometimes as another animal. And for many in these Eastern religions, what they do is they try to live their lives so well in such a pure way, often through doing yoga, that they break this cycle altogether and they get to become one with the divine. I know that seems a little unusual to us, but that's what they believe, and that's historically that's the historical purpose of yoga. Eventually, yoga was introduced in the late 1800s to the West by Swami Vivekananda, and it has mostly been practiced simply for the purpose of exercise, with its focus on postures and meditation. Now, is doing yoga in and of itself wrong? Well, it depends on what's the focus of the practice. There are many, even in the U.S. today, who practice it for a spiritual purpose, to achieve some form of enlightenment. And if you go to certain yoga studios, that is the message, or that is some of the teachings they're going to teach there. They're going to teach the spiritual principles behind it. Of course, there are many in the U.S. who do yoga specifically for the practice of improving your health, for exercise. And there are a lot of health benefits to doing yoga, anything from increased flexibility to increased muscle strength and tone, to weight reduction and athletic performance. In fact, there are a lot of athletes such as football players and martial artists and boxers who do yoga because it helps them in their overall performance. And there are many yoga studios who simply teach it from that perspective, in the sense that it is for your health, for your exercise. Now, if one seeks to do yoga for the purpose of it being a religious pursuit or a spiritual discipline, as many Eastern philosophies teach it as, I think one runs into serious issues there, especially if you are a Christian, because within the religious teachings of yoga and the religious teachings of many Eastern philosophies, there are a lot of ideas and concepts that are not compatible with Christianity. For example, in a lot of Eastern philosophies, and especially the ones that practice yoga, they don't have the same concept of God that we do. For example, they believe that you are God, and I am God, and our spirit is a part of the divine. I think we've all heard the phrase namaste, something that people who do yoga say to each other. You've probably even seen the t-shirt, namaste in bed. Well, I thought that was funny anyway. Anywho, what that phrase means is the divinity in me bows or acknowledges the divinity in you. And so we see they have a very different idea of what God is. We as Christians know that we are not God ourselves, but we are products of God. We are the offspring of God. And even though we seek to be with Him, we understand that our identities are separate. Also, the idea of the afterlife is very different. In many of these Eastern teachings, there is this idea of a continual life, death, and rebirth. And your goal is to break this cycle. We as Christians know that you have one life on this earth. You live it, and depending on how you respond to God in this life, depending on how you live in this life, determines your eternity. Also, the goals and these Eastern practices are very different. They are trying to escape this cycle of life, while we as Christians are trying to become as much like God, in the sense that our desires and our actions are in tune or line up with His will. Now, when it comes to a lot of, well, I guess any other religion any other religion that is different in general, of course it has some things about it that are probably true. But many of its concepts, for example, in the religious practice of yoga and in other religions, they have concepts that are completely incompatible with Christianity. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2, Paul says, "You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons." Now, of course, if the purpose of doing yoga is simply for exercise or for mental health, and it's simply done from that perspective or with that approach, I think that is completely acceptable. As Paul teaches in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8, he says, bodily exercise is profitable. Of course, we know godliness is more profitable, but nonetheless, bodily exercise is profitable. And if you strip yoga of its religious practices, it is simply no more than a form of exercise. Now, I think there are a lot of people, a lot of Christians who do enjoy yoga. I've done it with some friends who were interested in it, and I think it is a good and healthy practice. But if you do sign up for a school, make sure you check out the website. Make sure you know where the teachers are at with it, because some take it and they use it in a very religious way, while some simply use it as a form of exercise. So if you're doing research onto that, make sure you find a school that's going to line up with your Christian values. Now, the question asked in reference to Christian yoga, the person who asked the question asked, is Christian yoga appropriate for Christians? Well, Christian yoga, holy yoga, are specific branches of yoga practiced in the West. And I went to their websites and I did a little research on them. And I'll read you some of what I found from the Christian Yoga website. Christian Yoga is a term perhaps first coined by the way, I'm going to butcher this name. I can sound out Japanese names and Hebrew names and Greek names really well. When it comes to French names, I butcher it, so I apologize. The French monk, Jean-Marie Deconnet, like I said, I'm probably butchering it, he explored physical exercise in various forms as a way to connect with God. His book, A Christian Yoga, was written in the late 1940s. And Deconnet's practice and his writings in Christian yoga were born of a place of simple and pure worship and connection to Christ. He would strip himself of all his distractions to find stillness with the Lord for meditation and contemplation, adoration, prayer, praise, and worship. He wrote of bowing before the Lord or standing in praise, sometimes with no clothes on, much like David did before the Lord. Now, as you can see, they're clearly taking that passage out of context. Not saying that's inherently wrong. If you do that, make sure it's behind closed doors. But basically, the originator of this is a guy who was trying to explore worship through exercise. And the origin of this practice seems to originate with him. Now, there are aspects of Christian yoga that I don't think are compatible with what we read in the Bible. The site describes its practice as multi-denominational, and typically what that means is either they have no specific interest in a doctrine. If you have that many people working together on the same thing, they either have no care for their doctrine, or they have multiple, or they have different doctrinal ideas flying around which are inconsistent. One of the things I read about this that I thought was really concerning, they described Christian yoga as unabandoned and reckless and undistracted praise and worship. And I think there are a lot of issues with that phrase. I'm not sure worship should ever be described as reckless. We do have a record of people worshiping recklessly in the Bible, but they died. So for us, that sets a precedent that this is not something that God accepts. The best examples of this are Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 3, and their worship was reckless, and it cost them their lives. It also describes yoga in general as a form of worship. Now, I think there are serious issues with that. Now, if you want to do yoga for your exercise, for your health, to make you a better person, so you have a stronger attention span and you have more energy to do more for the Lord, I think that's great. But calling yoga in and of itself worship is an issue, because nowhere in the Old or the New Testament is exercise in and of itself a form of worship. God is always very precise and very particular about what he prescribes for his own worship. You can call anything worship. You can call grilling out or fishing worship, but it does not make it worship. And for those reasons, and for many of the things that they talk about Christian yoga, I don't think this is something that Christians should associate themselves with. I think if you're going to do yoga for your own exercise, I think that's fine, and you should do it as a Christian with Christian principles. But they mix a lot of weird, unusual ideas together, and I don't think it's appropriate for Christians to participate in Christian yoga. The next is holy yoga, and I was a little bit, to be honest, more impressed with their website. They had a far better understanding of the Bible than I would have expected of them. But at the end of the day, they still see yoga in and of itself as a form of worship. And with my earlier comments, you can see why one would be apprehensive about calling it that or treating it as a form of worship. I think if yoga is something you're interested in, do it as a form of exercise. Meditate, do the postures, do the exercise, maybe even sign up for a few classes. But I think I think you'd be going in the wrong direction if you try to follow these specific branches of yoga. Now, the next question is, how does a Christian let God handle or deal with his or her problems? How do we give God our problems? I think this is an excellent question. And I think there are three things we can do to make it easier for us to, quote-unquote, give our problems to God, or to simply leave them with God and let him deal with it without us worrying about it. And the first is having a Christian attitude. And this involves trust and acceptance. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 7, verses 8 through 11. Matthew chapter 7, verses 8 through 11. It's always quiet when I preach, but when there's so few people in here, it is a different kind of quiet. It is very different. It's a little hard to get used to. Matthew chapter 7, verses 8 through 11. Let's read that together. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. Or what man is there among you who, when his son asks for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will he give him a snake? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? Now, one of the things that Jesus is trying to emphasize is that, typically, good fathers know how to treat their children. If your son walks up to you and asks for some food, asks for some bread, especially if he's young and can't take care of himself, no good father is going to give him a stone instead. I could see Mylon giving Isaac a stone just to mess with him a little bit, but then he would give him some food, of course. You as parents know that if your child needs something such as food, you're going to give it to him because you love him. Well, Jesus says, if you being evil, that is, in comparison to how righteous God is, if you as parents know what to do for your children, God certainly knows what you need. And with that, we can trust God, knowing that he will take care of our needs. And the second thing we need to trust God with is found in Genesis chapter 18, verse 25. Genesis chapter 18, verse 25, where Abraham says, "Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly?" Or as some translations would say, "Will not the God of all the earth do what is right?" So for having a Christian attitude in the sense that we can trust God, to the sense that we can leave our problems with Him, we need to trust that He takes care of His own, and that He will always do the right thing. The second part to having this attitude of trust and acceptance is accepting certain things are out of our control. Read with me Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verses 11 through 12. Solomon writes, "I again saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, and the battle is not to the warriors, and neither is bread to the wise, nor wealth to the discerning, nor favor to the men of ability, for time and chance overtake them all. Moreover, man does not know his time, like a fish caught in a treacherous net, and birds trapped in a snare. So the sons of men are ensnared at an evil time, when suddenly it falls upon him." Now, what a gloomy passage. It is kind of true. What he says about life is true. Sometimes it's unfair. Sometimes the race is not to the swift. Sometimes it's to the one that gets lucky. Sometimes the battle's not to the warrior. Sometimes it's not to the one who's trained all his life in combat. Sometimes it's to the person who gets lucky. Sometimes food and wealth is not to the wise, but to the foolish person who gets lucky. He even says we're all kind of like fish. Some of us get trapped, some of us don't. And it can be a gloomy thought. But I think this is something that we have to accept as Christians. There are certain things in our life we can control, but to a greater extent, there are certain things in life that are just out of our control. That's why we must trust God, and trust God to save us from our troubles. As we see in Romans 8:28, God can cause even the bad things in our life to work for good. So we see, first of all, to have this, and having this Christian attitude, we have to trust God, and we have to accept that certain things are out of our control. The second thing we need to do is we need to pray, and I think one of the best illustrations of this is Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And I think we're all familiar with Hannah's story. She was a woman who was married to a man who was also married to another woman. And Hannah herself was barren. She could not have children, while her quote-unquote sister wife, as people would call it today, could have children. And her sister wife would often rebuke her and make fun of her and mock her because she couldn't have children, which is a pretty mean thing to do. As you can imagine, this weighed on her, and it did. But notice what it says in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 15. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 15. Notice what she tells Eli. She was praying before God, and tears running down her face, and her lips are moving with her words, and she says, "I have poured out my soul before the Lord." And that's exactly what she did. Everything that was on her heart, everything that was on her mind, she gave to God. But not only that, she left it there. Notice what it says in 1 Samuel 1:18. "So the woman," that is Hannah, "went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad." Now, she was very upset about this. She was in tears and crying, maybe even hyperventilating. And yet when she prayed to God, she left it there and went back and enjoyed the meal. Cleaned up her face, put on a smile. It wasn't a fake smile. She went back and she enjoyed the feast because she knew it was in God's hands. And as we'll see later, she was rewarded for it. And when we pray to God, when we're trying to, quote-unquote, give something to God, we have to leave it at His feet, trusting that He will handle it. And when we start to worry about it again, we leave it at His feet again, and we trust that He will handle it. The third and the final thing we need to do is we need to accept the outcome regardless. Sometimes the outcome might be exactly what we asked for, and we see that with Hannah. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 19, God gave her exactly what she wanted, a son. As we see in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 21, God gave her even more than what she asked for. Not only 5 children, but 6 children when she only prayed for one. And we see this very often throughout Scripture. God not only blesses us a little, he blesses us a lot. That's why David says in the 23rd Psalm, "My cup runneth over." Basically, he has so much he cannot contain it all. But often, well, I don't know about often, but from time to time, God also tells us no. We see this with Jesus when he prayed that this cup, talking about the cross, that it would pass from him, that he would not have to go to the cross. And we see that God told him no, even though he asked him 3 times. But this doesn't mean he wasn't heard. As we see in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7, Jesus was heard because of his piety. And not only that, he was aided as well. As we see in Luke chapter 22, verse 43, God sends an angel to strengthen him, to help him, to support him. And Paul is another good example of this, as we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul describes he describes his issue as a thorn in his side, and of course there's a lot of debate as to what it was. Many scholars think it was some health issue that was hindering him. And in that passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, he prays to God 3 times that it would be taken from him, likely so he could do even more in his ministry. And God told him no. And we see why in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 9. It wasn't that God was being mean. It was that God could do more for Paul when he had this weakness than when he didn't. God said that his power is perfected in weakness. So it was doing more for Paul with this thorn, even though it was an inconvenience. And we must accept that whether we get exactly what we want or more, or something completely different, we need to accept it as a Christian, because as we see in Genesis 18:25, the judge, the Lord of all the earth, will do what is right. He will do what is just. So the question again is, how does a Christian let God handle or deal with his or her problems? How do we give our problems to God? And the first thing we have to do is we have to have a Christian attitude, one of trust and acceptance. The second thing we need to do is we need to pray about whatever is on our heart and leave it all before him. And finally, we need to accept the outcome, because whatever God will choose to do with our problem, it will be the right thing. The last question for tonight is, what is the difference between a type and an antitype? The Greek word for type is tupos, and it is used in very many ways throughout the New Testament. This word, originally defined as a mark of a blow, or from a stamp that was, or then a stamp that was struck by a die. It is a word that has been used for many different things. It can refer to a figure that is a copy or an image. We'll see how some of these are used. It can also be used as a pattern or a model. And it can also be used as a type or a prefiguring of something or somebody. I think this is probably where we get the idea for the typewriter. A typewriter has a ribbon that when you push a letter, it stamps an image on the paper. That's probably where we get the idea from it. Now, it is the word tupos, the word type, is used and is translated in many different ways. For example, in John chapter 20, verse 25, it is used to refer to the scars in the body of Jesus, the imprints on his hand, because it was a blow struck by the nail. It is also, and I'll slow down a little bit in case you're getting notes, in Acts chapter 7, verse 43, it's also used to refer to images or idols. Acts chapter 7, verse 43. Paul also uses it in Romans chapter 5, verse 14, where he refers to Adam as a type of Christ. Romans chapter 5, verse 14. Paul writes, "Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses, even though those who had not sinned in the likeness of the offense of Adam, who is a type," or sometimes translated is as a figure of him, that is Jesus, who was to come. It is also used in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 7. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 7, as the example certain Christians set for each other. The Thessalonians, the church at Thessalonica, was setting a good example to the other churches. So Paul wrote, so that you became an example, that is a type or a pattern, to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. It is also in Titus chapter 2, verse 7, to refer to a pattern or an example of good works. And it's used in several other passages, but we'll end in Romans chapter 6, verse 17. We'll end there for the type. Paul uses it in the sense as a form or a pattern of doctrine. Paul writes, "But thanks be to God that though you were slaves of sin, you became obedient from the heart to that form." That is, that word for form there is type. That type or that form or that pattern of teaching, you were committed. So we see this word type or tupos in the Greek is used in so many different ways. And the word antitype or antitupos is only used twice in the New Testament. And it has a lot of similar meanings that correspond to the word type. It means to be typical of or to represent by a type. And it's often translated or sometimes translated as something that corresponds to something else, as you'll see when we look at the passages. It's used, the first of which is in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 24. The Hebrew writer uses it to refer to the tabernacle. He says, "For Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy, antitype, of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us." Basically, what the Hebrew writer is saying is that he's talking about the tabernacle or the temple, and he refers to it as a copy of something that exists in heaven. How literal or how figurative that copy is, I'm not sure. But basically what he's saying is that the temple or the tabernacle is modeled off of something in heaven. It's also used in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21. In the context of 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter is talking about the flood, and he makes a very interesting analogy. He talks about how Noah was saved, not by the ark, but by water. He says 8 souls were saved through water. And he says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21, he says, corresponding to that, and that word correspond is the word antitype. The copy, the pattern of that is baptism. As the water saved Noah and his family, the water now saves them. Baptism now saves you not as the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's interesting that the New King James Version literally just translates it as antitype. It says, there is also an antitype which now saves us. Baptism. Now, we see that these words are pretty similar. They're used in a lot of similar ways, but I suppose, but it does seem they have a few differences. It seems that the word type has a few nuances and perhaps more flexibility than the word antitype. The word type seems to be used regarding anything that leaves an impression, or anything that is a copy of anything else. For example, idols, they are copies of things here on earth. It can be used as, for example, the imprints on the hand of Christ, anything that leaves an impression. The word is also used often in a doctrinal sense to refer to the way or the pattern by which we live our lives, or the pattern, I'll say pattern, the pattern that we follow in reference to doctrine. In Titus 2:7, Paul writes, "In all things show yourself to be an example," that is a type, "of good deeds with purity and doctrine." In Romans 6:17 through 18, I'll read again. "But thanks be to God that though you were slaves of sin, you became obedient from the heart to that form," that pattern of teaching, "to which you were committed. And having been freed from sin, you became slaves of righteousness." But it is also used in Romans 5:14 in a very interesting way to describe Adam as a type of Christ. And typically when we use the word type, just in our own conversations, we typically use it in that sense to refer to things in the Old Testament that were types of things to come in the New Testament, especially types of Christ. We see Adam, in some sense, was a type of Christ. There are other men, especially men like Moses, who seem to be clear types of Christ. We see in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18, that Moses is supposed to have someone come later who is like him. And that's what Moses says. God is going to raise up someone like Moses. And Jesus was like Moses in a lot of ways. He was a man who saved his people. He was a man who was in many ways rejected by his people. And he was also a lawgiver. He gave the teachings of God. So Moses, in a sense, is a type of Christ. And there are some people, unfortunately, who go too far with this typology. Some people who are a little afraid to go anywhere but what is exactly described in the New Testament as a type. But typically when we refer to something as a type, that's what we mean. We're talking about something that was instituted or someone who lived in the Old Testament that represents someone else who is to come in the future. Now, the word antitype, I can only say so much about it. It's only used 2 different times in the New Testament. The word is used once in reference to the Hebrew writer who talks about the tabernacle being a copy of something that existed presently, or I guess still exists presently because it is in heaven. And Peter uses it in the sense that baptism is a copy of something that once existed in the past. So we see that they have a lot of overlapping nuances, but they seem to have ones that are also unique to themselves. Now, of course, if you go throughout your week and you come across something you'd like us to look into, or if you have a question you've always wanted to answer, please feel free to write a question, and we'll be able to get to it on one of the first Sunday nights of the month. And if you ever have anything personally you'd like to ask us or something you'd like us to study on, please feel free to shoot us an email. We would be glad to look into it. Now, before we conclude tonight, if there's anyone who would like prayers about anything particularly in their life, anything you'd like us to pray about, we would love to go to God on your behalf. And God will certainly help you in any way that you need it. And if there's anyone here tonight who was once obedient to the gospel, who is no longer living in a manner pleasing to God, we would love to pray for you, and God certainly will forgive you. If there's anything we can do for you tonight spiritually, please come forward as we stand and sing.